Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Brexit, the new rules for moving thoroughbreds between the UK and the EU. TBA Chief Executive Claire Sheppard will be speaking with TBA Trustee Peter Mendham, BBA Shipping's Kevin Needham and Weatherbys Simon Cooper. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible during the allocated time. And now over to Claire.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlotte, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We have a number of slides that will outline the key steps involved in importing and exporting thoroughbreds to the EU in the position as of today, and we'll be following this with a comprehensive Q&A. Today's webinar is the second in a series, the first one we held in mid-December, since when obviously the transition period has ended and there's been a successful conclusion to the negotiations of a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU. The advice we're giving today is based on the gov.uk websites and where we've sought further clarification on behalf of the industry. It's important to state up front that there are still areas where we await answers, so we do not have all of the answers to the questions that have been posed. We'll obviously continue to issue guidance, regular guidance, as the picture becomes clearer. We have warned for many months that the conclusion of a free trade agreement does not mean that everything carries on as it did before, and in fact far from it, as the UK's relationship with the EU countries has fundamentally changed. Most pertinently for thoroughbred movements, the tripartite agreement has ended as it was part of EU legislation. So the UK is now a third country with no access to the customs union or single market, and trade is being governed by the EU's third country regulations. The free trade agreement has facilitated tariff-free trade, and Peter will explain in a little bit more detail later the position around geldings, but it's had minimal, if any, impact on the non-tariff requirements of third countries, which we now need to follow. These include checks at the border and customs requirements. Today's webinar will very much focus on the position as of today. The EU Animal Health Law is due to be introduced in April, which, if implemented, would further change these requirements. We're purposely not covering this today and plan to cover it in a future webinar as negotiations on key aspects of this are still ongoing. Next slide, please. So since we last updated you on this, the EU has taken two fundamental steps to facilitate ongoing trade in thoroughbreds, in addition to the free trade agreement. The first was recognising the Weatherbys General Stud Book, which means we can move thoroughbred horses as registered horses. The EU has also given the UK an animal health listing status of Category A. Without having this listing, we wouldn't have been able to move horses at all. We also know that each horse transported must travel with their Weatherbys horse passport as valid equine ID. As there is now a border, paperwork will be required. In the past, you were able to turn up at the port, but now you need to turn up and this all needs to be in order. And it is vital that it's completed correctly, or you could be refused entry for your consignment. It's also worth highlighting at this early stage that the definition of temporary and permanent imports and exports is different for health certification purposes and for customs, and this will be explained later in the webinar. Our very strong guidance is to appoint a shipper, transporter and/or customs agent, as the process is now much more complex, especially at the moment, and to ensure your paperwork is correct to avoid any disappointment and delays to your valuable horses. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So firstly, we'll be covering exporting horses from Great Britain to an EU country, including France and Ireland. So in order to get an export health certificate, you need 2 blood tests, and the analysis must be undertaken by the Animal Plant and Health Agency laboratory in Weybridge. The 2 tests required are for equine infectious anemia and for equine viral arteritis. Our advice is to contact your vet at least 6 weeks or so before travel in order to make the arrangements for the visit and so that the tests can be done in good time, as they will need to be processed by the APHA in Weybridge. Secondly, you need to ensure your mare or foal has been kept on a UK or EU holding with horses of a similar health status and under veterinary supervision. This means that the horse you are transporting must not come into direct contact with other horses that do not meet the same health standards. What this means in practice, we're still seeking clarification with the APHA, and we will issue further guidance when we've received it. We've had many questions in advance around foals at foot and if they can travel if they're under 30 days. And this is our current understanding of the position. So based on Article 23 of EU legislation 2015/262, prior to weaning, foals will not require their own passport to travel. However, at this time, there's a lack of clarity as to whether foals will be considered a separate epidemiological unit from their dams, and thereby be classified as unregistered, which would mean they need to have their own EHC and 30 days quarantine from their date of birth prior to travelling. The EU task force, of which Simon Cooper is a member, and he'll be joining us for the Q&A today, is working hard to find solutions to this. They are very aware, and they got the support of the chief veterinary officers from many of the EU member states. In the meantime, the TBA does not endorse a temporary separation of foals from their dams for the sole purpose of facilitating walkout coverings of mares in a different country. And I'd hand over to Kevin.
On my back. Export health certificates. We have a new system which you have to be registered to access. You need a government gateway account. The health certificate has gone from being no pieces of paper to a sort of 11-page booklet, which is quite involved. And unless your vet's based in Newmarket, he really is going to have a bit of a head scratcher. The EU seem to be particularly focusing on whereabouts the rubber stamps are, and we did have a horse yesterday that was denied entry into France because there was a dispute between the UK government and the French government about the positioning of the rubber stamps. But hopefully, as we move down the road, they'll all decide where the stamps need to be. For the vast majority of thoroughbred horses, accessing an OV who can certify your horse is a fairly straightforward procedure. Most of the big equine practices, they're all OVs, so that's not a problem. You do need to plan ahead though, because ensuring that the bloods have been into the lab properly and not falling foul of interpretations to do with equivalent health status. It is an area of discussion at the moment, and many of the OVs are having a lot of exchange with UK Gov about what constitutes equivalency of health status and or isolation for permanent horses. We've only got the 4 health certificates. There's a black hole in the system in that if you brought a horse from, say, the USA or Hong Kong into London Airport, it can't just go straight to Ireland anymore. It has to remain, because there's no facility under EU legislation. EU legislation requires the animal has to land directly into the Union, and there's no transit certification, and the EU import conditions require that the animal has been resident in the country of dispatch for 90 days. So if there was a guy yesterday who wanted to buy something in America, a filly to take to Ireland, and the only way to get it there was via London, and the answer is don't bother, because you've no chance of getting it there before May at this stage. By the time she's done 30 days in America and another 90 days here, that's 4 months down the road. So that's the fun bit about the export health certificates. Could I have the next slide? The biggest change for going out into the EU is the access through a border control post. The one in Ireland is fairly switched on. They've already agreed that they're not going to have horse boxes unloaded. They're just going to do a documentary check. They are open for 24 hours a day. It is going to mean that during busy times there'll be a queue, but I think once they start getting used to how many horse boxes come off that ferry, that things will start to speed up quite quickly. It's a very different story when we look across the channel. And that's why where they say, well, we're talking about exporting to an EU country, the two things going into mainland Europe there's a very different set of interpretations to going into Ireland. When we're going into Calais, the BCP is only open during office hours and closes for lunch. And you have to book in 48 hours before you want to be there, and you're given your slot. If you miss your slot, you either have to remain in Dover or wait in the car park for the next available slot. Their operating procedure is they can probably handle something like 14 horse boxes a day, which wouldn't be sufficient on a busy day. The opening hours are vexatious in that during the summer months it takes away our ability to operate moving horses at night when it's cooler. We have to operate during office hours, and that's something that we're working on to try and amend. There is a BCP through the Channel, but the Channel Tunnel has increased its rates to the point where it's no longer an economically viable proposition unless you're just taking one horse box with one horse on it, because they're charging £350 per additional horse just to go through on the train. All the BCPs require you to book in before you go, and obviously going out through Dover, you have to get a Kent access pass before you can actually get onto the motorway to get to Dover. You need a COVID test as part of your Kent access pass for your drivers. And if you're in a vehicle over 7.5 tons, there is no provision to get to the front of the queue. So you will sit in the queue with all of the other heavy goods vehicles, because horses are not part of their accelerated operating model. If there's an animal welfare issue, we've just been told to ring Kent Police. So those sort of non-tariff barriers are causing us quite a lot of operational problems at the moment. Next slide. Transporter authorization. This really is the hot potato of the moment, as I said in the Racing Post on Saturday. It's slowly getting resolved. We're quite lucky that Ireland have been incredibly helpful. All my lorries are going to Dublin tomorrow empty at no light expense to be examined on Dublin docks. All my drivers have been recertified, and we have an application in for a Type 2 authorization. Any Irish-based drivers have been given reciprocation through DEFRA, so they can just download their certificates. But I'm not aware yet of any Irish-based transporters that have managed to get their vehicles certified or have obtained a Type 2 authorization in the UK. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that none have. Certainly none of the French, Spanish, Italians, Dutch, Belgians, Germans, Poles, Hungarians, Yugoslavs have been over and had their vehicles examined. And that's obviously a problem for international trade going forward when it comes to sales times, because a lot of their drivers are going to have to sit exams and do tests here. Lots of people asked about transporter authorizations. Does it apply to them? It's a difficult question to answer because the interpretation is for the man the other side. Certainly if you're going through Dublin in a stud lorry with the stud's own horses on it, I would suggest that the likelihood is that they won't ask for your transporter authorization. It'll just go through as a private box. It's difficult to argue that the purpose of your journey isn't commercial, however, and if you went through Calais and somebody was being particularly tricky, you may well have a discussion. There's certainly a discussion to be had about the nature of your journey. I know there have been a couple of horse boxes gone out with show jumpers on, driven by their owners, and that's actually being driven by the owner of the horse. There's quite a lot of stud boxes where you wouldn't expect the owner to normally be driving it. And I think the owner-driven ones are probably have a better chance of arguing that it's a sort of non-commercial journey and a transporter authorization is not required. But largely, any horse box going out on a commercial journey should have a transporter authorization. But that's been the case for a number of years in any case. It's just now we need to have one both sides of the EU-UK divide. Can I have the next slide, please? Coming in from the EU is actually rather simpler than going out. You need to have access to the IPAF system, which normally your transporter or shipping agent or whoever will have access to. You're going to have a health certificate from the EU to here, but that's quite a simple health certificate. It's not the sort of 11-page booklet that we have to use going there. It's a couple of pages that say that the horse has no diseases. So that bit's fairly straightforward. We currently don't have border checks either. So provided your customs clearance goes through, you don't need to stop. Nothing gets examined, in you come. You do, of course, have to make a customs entry in the union, and you have to make another customs entry and account for VAT and or duty in whichever way you need to do it on the way in. And you're obviously going to have to employ a customs agent to make those entries. We hope that before the 1st of July, there's been some resolution, but after that, we're told that the UK will be having its own BCPs, and there could be the potential for physical checks on the way in as well. That really is going to slow us down a lot more than we already are. That's the next one, please. Customs processes. I think this was one for Peter, but because I've been talking about it quite a lot as well, so we might come back to some questions about that at the end. So over to you, Peter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Kevin. I think, as Kevin said, he's dealt with a lot of this. But I suppose the point to make is that the trade agreement made absolutely no difference to any of this in terms of having to complete customs declarations for both sides, the export and the import. So it's two lots of customs declarations to be made for every journey. And I think it's absolutely essential that you use a customs agent, because they will be able to steer you through the questions of the types of declarations, the value, the commodity codes, etc. As Claire has already mentioned, one thing that did change with the trade agreement was that the tariff on geldings was removed. But it was only removed to the extent that it met the EU origin conditions, and that is that the animal itself was wholly produced. And for horses, that means it was born and raised in, I haven't checked the fine print yet, but I think it's within the trade area, so in the either UK or Ireland. So any gelding that was born outside of that, notwithstanding that it may have paid duty coming into the area, that would appear to fall outside of the duty-free status, and you may have to pay VAT on non-originating geldings. I think that's all I need to say on the customs processes. If we could have the next slide, please. Some things have changed on VAT, but most actually haven't. I mean, we say check VAT guidance, but I've spent most of today going through various elements of the VAT guidance, and I mean, I've been doing this for longer than I care to remember, and I still find some of the information very difficult to find, partly because the changes have been introduced very late. But what are the important things? If you export a horse from the UK, it's now zero rated, provided you provide proof of export. And that's anywhere outside of the UK, whether it goes to the EU or a third country. When it gets to the other side, there will be potentially VAT due there, depending whether or not it's a temporary movement to that country or not. And we'll come back to that in the questions and answers. When the horse comes back, if you bring it back after a period of up to 3 years, in fact, you should be able to get duty-free entry, sorry, VAT-free entry, providing you were the person that shipped it out. Where mares have gone out to be covered, the only VAT consequence will, in the UK, will be that you will probably have to pay VAT on the cost of the process, i.e. the value added to the mare. And that historically was always calculated on the nomination fee. Now I say you might do or should do, because a lot of what we will say today will be based upon the procedures before the single market came in, because a lot of these issues haven't really been tested in the last 30 years. So we're using that part, both Kevin and I are using our past experience of what the position used to be, and obviously checking that against what the position appears to be through HMRC guidance. I think that will be the position. And I would point out that if you do suffer any VAT, either on an imported horse or on the process cost when you have sent a mare out to be covered, that you don't have to pay that at the port or airport. You can defer that and put it through the next VAT return. Somewhat similar to the way that we do now with acquisitions from other member states. And providing it's a business transaction, the VAT that you account for is automatically deducted on that same return. So there's nil cost on that. Temporary imports are the area that I think we found most difficulty in actually establishing the precise position. The first problem is that mares going out, you're looking at the procedures in the country where the mare is going, which is obviously outside of the control of the UK authorities or beyond our ability to check. Kevin and I have been trying to sort out the position with Ireland, because that's the most likely destination for mares going out to be covered. But the likelihood is, and I think you should accept that in most cases, you will be required to provide some form of security. Even though if you go in on a temporary basis, the receiving country will want security for any VAT that might become payable in case the horse isn't returned. And that will be based on the potential VAT due if it goes into home use in that country. That can either be through a customs declaration or through an ATA carnet. Now, the slight difference on those, one or two differences, an ATA carnet is an annual document. You can use it for any movements during the course of that year. But the security there is provided by the carnet issuer. And they take the worst possible scenario. So their requirement for security will be based upon the total of the maximum number of taxes that could be payable. And even though there may be a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU, they will still factor in any potential duty costs. So the security baseline for a carnet tends to be much higher. And you still have to provide security for that in some form or other. But you can use it more than once. So probably more suitable for racing horses where they may be traveling across the border several times a year. For mares, it's less useful, I think. There's been a question about whether or not carnets can be used for mares going for breeding, because there's a slight change in the mare because it's being covered. Carnets issued in the UK, and I would stress issued in the UK, actually refer to horses going for breeding or animals going for breeding. So I assume that you would be able to use a carnet for mares going to Ireland or another country to be covered. Security is per horse, and if you export the horse, you will get it back, but there will be a waiting time, which can be, I mean, Kevin will correct me later, but you're talking 6 to 8 weeks, probably minimum, before you get that security released. And if you're using one form of security for a number of movements, it will normally be only eligible for the value up to that level So the sooner you get that security released, then you can put other horses into that process. But that will be a problem for people who have numbers of horses that they're moving under temporary importation procedures and using security. And I've put a note at the bottom, requirements for security may vary between, well, they will vary. I mean, the one thing about the EU is that although it's meant to be the same, it's always different. So the requirements for security will certainly vary between member countries. And we would encourage everybody to make sure that you speak to the agent well in advance of the movement, so you are prepared for what you're facing when the horse gets to the other side. The last thing anybody wants is for the horse to get there, and then the security isn't acceptable once you get the horse to the other side. So please speak to the agents, your shipping agents, your customs agents, and make sure that you understand what will be required. And putting security in place, particularly for higher values, isn't something you can do overnight. So the more time you have to prepare for that, the better. I think that was my last slide, I think. So questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Peter and Kevin. And for this session, we're also going to be joined by Simon Cooper from Weatherbys, who's director of the General Stud Book here. Simon has been involved on the International Sports Horse Confederation task force, which has been looking at, from the EU side, at resolving some of these issues. So we've invited Simon as well to join our panel. We've had a large number of questions in advance, many questions. We'll endeavour to answer as many as we can in this session. Some of them have already been covered, hopefully, with slides, but we'll go through those, and please do ask any other questions using the Q&A function. The most questions we got actually was on VAT, so I think Peter and Kevin will start off with the two of you, and we'll go through the VAT questions and then go on to the others that have been asked. So the first question is security needed for VAT for horses temporarily sent to the EU for covering and grazing?
As far as we can establish it, you've got to expect it will be. There is a suggestion that Ireland, for instance, if the horse goes for a period, they don't require security for grazing, or in fact even one or two other things, but that we're trying to establish whether or not that is available in all cases. But the likelihood is that you will have to pay security, and certainly we haven't found anything that suggests that there will be any possible relief on horses going to France.
No, I think the French situation is, from what I've been, the problem is with a lot of these things is the changes have come about this week, which is why we're not being conclusive. You know, the option for the grazing letter is something that I think popped up on Tuesday. Something else that we may talk about being able to import horses under your own VAT number when you don't own them is something that popped out of the woodwork yesterday. The French system, I think, is pretty clear. They don't permit temporary imports on horses anymore. So you are limited to either paying it and getting it back after the horse comes back by a different process. So instead of it being 6 to 8 weeks, you're looking at 9 months, or you use a carnet. And as we've discussed, the deposit on the carnet is 40% of the horse's value. Some of the French have said just give the horse a low value, or there is an indemnity you can sign so you don't have to pay it, a sort of insurable indemnity. There's a way around it, but it's quite restrictive.
Thank you. I think it's fair to say with all of this, we're learning on a day-by-day basis at the moment, aren't we? Both through the questions that we've asked of government for clarification, and also from the experiences that everyone who has actually started to move horses are sort of feeding back to us, aren't we? So we'll keep updating everybody. So the next question I've got, I think Peter, you've answered in part, but I'll ask the whole question and then we can pick up, because I think there's elements perhaps we haven't, which is, Do we have to pay VAT to the UK government when we send mares abroad for covering? Can we minimise their values, and would any VAT money need to be paid to the Irish or French governments if that was where we were sending our mares?
Well, the first point, you don't have to pay any VAT when you send it out. The only possibility of paying VAT would be when it comes back on the VAT on the cost of the covering. You minimise the values at your own risk. It's a legal declaration, and whilst you may get away with it if the horse comes back, if the horse doesn't come back and the duty gets called to, VAT gets called to account, there will be questions asked if for instance, if you sold the horse and the sale price is way over the declared value, there will be trouble ahead. So I think you have to to be safe, you have to put a fair value on. They will obviously accept independent valuations from agents, but they would also accept a fair appraisal. But I would encourage people to put fair values on. I mean, it's very difficult. Nobody can say the value of a horse with any certainty, but I think most of us have a reasonable idea what a particular horse is worth at that moment in time, and that's the value that should be used.
And in terms of paying any VAT money to the Irish or French governments?
Well, you would only pay if the horse didn't return. Good. So effectively, the VAT that was payable at importation, which you have deferred in effect, pending re-export, if the horse doesn't get re-exported, that then becomes payable at the local rate, which will be, say, 13% in Ireland, or if it's a course coming in here, it would be 20% in the UK.
Sure. Thank you.
I think it's Claire. It's fair to stress that if we're onto a payment system, if say this grazing letter or other workarounds don't work, the only available option in Ireland is a cash deposit. So you are paying them the VAT, the whole amount of VAT as a deposit in any case. And if you're not using a carnet going into France, you are paying the full amount of VAT at the point of arrival and then getting it back 9 months later. So there is a cash flow implication under either of those two systems.
Thank you, Kevin. The next question is actually somebody's a specific example, so I'll read that out. I'm walking in French-owned mares to Newmarket stud farms as usual for clients who supply a French VAT number and for whom I customarily zero rate the invoice. I also have European clients who are not VAT registered and for whom I charge VAT. This year, from the 1st of January, should I continue to charge VAT to both VAT and non-VAT registered clients? And will I be required to complete an EU sales list or something similar?
The answer is nothing changes, other than that you will no longer have to complete a sales list, which was one of the few good things to come out of this. The reason you didn't charge VAT on these services before was not necessarily because the customer was in the EU, but because they were in business. And having a VAT number was an indicator that they were in business. So the VAT liability of those services won't actually change. If they're not in business, you will charge VAT. If they are VAT registered, you need not. You can still put the VAT number on the invoice if you wish, but it won't be a requirement.
Surely, Peter, if it's a cross-border movement, it's zero rated anyway.
This services.
The service may well be the transportation of the horse, though. It's not clear from the question.
Well, I assume that this was boarding costs.
Yeah, fair enough.
Great. We've had a question asked on live, so I'm going to ask that next. If a mare is sent for covering in Ireland, how is the import VAT reconciled with the VAT on the covering fee?
Is this, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. There should be no VAT on the Irish VAT on the covering fee if this is an Irish cover, unless it's being sold by a UK person, in which case there will. But when the horse comes back, in theory, you charge VAT on the cost of that process. And the cost of the process is obviously the nomination fee. So UK VAT would be due on the nomination fee that was actually paid. and that's the figure that would be payable at import. But if you're VAT registered, that's the figure that you then account for on the next following VAT return. So the VAT coming back is based upon the cost of the nomination, the cost of the process.
Okay, thank you. So if a mare is walking into Ireland as a temporary import and she needs to return for a second or third cover, does the VAT on her value have to be paid on each visit, or does the initial sum paid cover her until such time as it is reclaimed? Are ATA carnets really a valid option, as goods have to return in the same condition, e.g. not impregnated? The carnet has to be physically stamped in and out the country by HMRC, and the EU rate would I believe be 40%.
Yeah, I think we've already dealt with the carnet point. On the first point, it's a separate movement, and it's a question whether I think it's unlikely, given the timescales, that the first deposit would have been repaid. And I'm not sure, as a matter of practice, whether you can actually, even though it's self-evident that the mare has left after the first movement, I'm not sure, as a matter of practice, whether you can use the security that they already have for the second one. I don't know if you can throw any light on that, Kevin, but I would think probably not.
You can't. In the situation where you're putting up a cash bond, you'd have to keep putting up a fresh cash bond every time you went back. In the event where it's apparent that the grazing letter exemption is valid, you would just put in a separate grazing letter, in which case no money would change hands. And the carnet, as discussed, the UK system is you're allowed to use it for breeding stock, and the EU rate of 40% can be not payable provided you sign an indemnity.
Excellent, good. We've got a couple of questions about the impact on sales, VAT and tax implications there for horses that are brought to Britain from the EU to be sold. Will their value for import be their sales price? And if so, when will this become payable? And is it the vendor or the purchaser who is responsible for paying any import tax VAT? And we've got another question around what is your prediction for the sales companies and their clients, given obviously that a large number of the consigners at UK sales are coming particularly from Ireland. I mean, obviously we haven't got the sales company specifically on these calls, but I don't know if either of you wanted to comment on the impact on the sales and how they may deal with this.
Well, the sales houses have got an arrangement with HMRC called a docket scheme, whereby they import the horses against their VAT number into the UK, and then account for the VAT on the sale through their own VAT return. And that's been in place for a number of years. It hasn't been used much in recent years. And the value that they use is a kind of standard value based upon previous year's sales. But that's all handled with, the VAT accounting is all dealt with by Tattersalls if people want them to do it, which obviously it's much easier for a non-UK vendor to get the sales company, as Tattersalls engulfs. It's much easier for a non-UK vendor to get the sales company to deal with that. And as long as the sales company are aware of that fact, they will process that. They will deal with the import VAT. It goes through their VAT account. They then issue a VAT invoice to the purchaser, assuming that VAT is due on that if the horse stays here, and then the purchaser pays Tattersalls the VAT. So that system works quite well and has done for a number of years. And I think it will continue to work, whether or not that, although it sounds a strange system, it is actually, it has backing in the law. And in theory, it should work equally in horses going from here to Ireland or France to be sold. And I think it does work. I think it does work in Ireland, I think, doesn't it, Kevin? I think the Irish...
I was trying to think this the other day. I don't recall an Irish docket system from the 80s, because back in those days, the Irish VAT was only 2.5%.
Well, I don't think they even had VAT on horses till 1990.
No, so I don't think we had a docket scheme. So I don't, the docket scheme itself seems quite old-fashioned, because it is. But I don't believe that there ever was one in Ireland. So.
Well, I would assume that both the auctioneers in Ireland will be using the docket scheme in the UK, that they will try and make that work in Ireland.
I would hope they would, yes. I think that the Irish situation is probably more resolvable than the French situation.
Yeah, I think that would be more of a problem.
That I can see that if you're an English vendor wanting to go and sell in France, you're going to have to pay the VAT going in, and the horse will be sold non-VAT in France. And the VAT is your problem.
Yeah. That was actually one of the other questions, is what about, British breeders selling in Ireland or France? But I mean, I think that's something that maybe we can follow up, ask some questions of the sales houses. They are involved on some of the Brexit group, so we can put those questions to them. No, I think we were due to have some actually joining this as audience members. So if they want to comment on the Q&A, they're very welcome to. So in terms of other questions that we've been asked on the VAT angle, if you're walking in a mare with a foal at foot for cover, will you need to put the VAT value for both the mare and foal for security, or is it just the mare's value?
No, it's both.
Both.
Okay, thank you. That's a quick one. Do we have to pay the VAT on import back to the UK, even though we haven't paid the nomination fee, i.e. 1st of October or live foal terms?
Yeah, it's based upon the value of the fee rather than the fact that when you actually pay it. And it will be assumed that because it's coming back, and presumably it's coming back because you think it's in foal, you would pay upon that. If the mare isn't in foal, you probably could argue that you shouldn't have to pay it. But at that stage, I think you would have to pay it because it's coming back immediately after the cover.
Excellent.
If you're VAT registered, it doesn't really matter because it's an in and out in the VAT return anyway.
Yeah. We've been asked for some sort of recommendations for custom agents dealing with customs declarations, and also to produce some flow charts. So we'll take those recommendations away, those questions away, and come back to everybody with those. So should we move on to? We've got movement of horses for covering. We've got a few questions on this. First one, if a mare is walking into Ireland as a temporary import and she needs to return for a second or third cover, what's her position?
In terms of the VAT position, she's going to have, we discussed this earlier, she's going to have to come up every time she goes back. She needs a health certificate, and then the health certificate again on return. She needs a customs entry out, a customs entry in every single time she goes backwards and forwards. And if any of the workarounds are not available and it's on a cash deposit, there'll be a separate cash deposit to pay.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any changes as to how long horses can stay in France and Ireland, and will the paperwork change for broodmares? I think the paperwork will certainly change, Kevin, as we've outlined, but in terms of how long they can stay.
There's two hairs running here. One of them is the VAT situation, where a temporary import can be for up to 2 years. The other one is the health status, where there are two health certificates available. One's permanent and one is up to 90 days. If you sent a horse over on a 90-day paper, the Ireland are not used to 90-day horses being converted to permanents, but I think they probably have to get used to it. But then the EU argues that that's doing it without the isolation and the additional blood tests. But I've always argued that by the time the horse has been there, if they're letting them in without isolation for 3 months, any diseases they've got, they're going to have passed on anyway. So it seems slightly academic. It's just the way the EU legislation's worded. But from a tax position, you've got up to 2 years.
And paperwork-wise, Simon, I wondered if I could bring you in here. Is there anything additional that people will need to do with Weatherbys when moving the horses, whether temporarily or permanently?
No, I mean, it's you still require to provide an export certificate for permanent exports, or a BCN, or if it's a racehorse, an RCN. If it's neither, it's a general notice, a GNM. So, but no, that won't. The changes are around because there's both the industry requirements and the government health requirements, and there's also the financial requirements, to put them into sort of three categories. The financial requirements and the government health requirements, yes, there's a great deal more because we're now a third country, but in terms of the industry, and that really is Weatherbys and the BHA requirements, no, that remains the same.
Okay, thank you. And then just one sort of final question on the customs and tax side of things. Do we anticipate any progress or removal of tax implications prior to the covering season commencing in February?
Clarification, I would hope for. Changes, probably not.
Kevin, did you want to comment on that one?
There are, Peter and I have spoken about this at length. There are, for the Anglo-Irish situation, there may be a workaround that means that nobody has to chuck vast amounts of money backwards and forwards in order to keep these mares moving. But some of the changes have really only occurred this week, and to actually, when you read something, you think, brilliant, that works for me. But until you actually attempt to do it, for example, we were all sort of lauding ourselves. We've got a tariff-free deal. There's no VAT no duty on geldings. The first gelding you go to bring in over €6,000, and the computer says no. As soon as you try and put it into the computer system on Chief, it just rejects it because it's too much money, and you have to produce then an additional certification to prove it was wholly manufactured in the EU. And so you don't know until you actually try this whether it's going to work. And getting direct answers to direct questions from either revenue authorities on either side of the Irish Sea is not a speedy process.
That's an understatement. But we're doing what we can to work through this and get clarification. But as Kevin says, it's changing on a daily basis because most of the links between the UK and Ireland, the customs people doing that haven't had to do anything for years. There haven't been any customs people in those places for years. And these systems are mostly new to them as well. So I think they're finding their way. Certainly that's the case, well, is in England and Ireland. I'm sure the rest of Europe as well.
Yes, I was just going to say the same, Peter, in that the TPA, the tripartite agreement, we were in such a privileged position. And of course, now that has gone, we are that free, completely seamless movement that we've enjoyed for 40 plus, nearly 50 years, has of course gone. So there is quite a shock to the system, and not forgetting that on the top of Brexit, on the 21st of April, we have the animal health law coming in, and then our transition period ends at the end of June. So, we're not by any means through the woods. In fact, I'd say we're probably sort of the early part of it. But I'm confident that it will improve. I think part of the problem that we've had is that the free trade agreement came so late, and the second point I think I should make is that we're not aware of any impact assessment study being done by the EU in advance of the animal health law being put into law. And so, there are obviously potential requirements for some change as we work through how that is going to work. And it was never envisaged when the legislation was written. It was very much written as a distant third country, or a third country that didn't sit between two EU member states. And I think that's what is another problem. So we're in a unique position in that we have movements going through us from a member state into a third country and then back into a member state.
Just sort of going back to one of the previous questions and your response, we've been asked for a little bit more information about the grazing letter exemption. Is there anything more we can say at this point in time, or is that something for us, do you think, to follow up as in our FAQs? Because is that still, that sounds to me, Kevin, as though that's something that's only just recently come forward.
Yeah, but it's a recent sort of resurrection of something we haven't seen for a quarter of a century. And it worked a quarter of a century ago, but nobody had actually seen mention of it in any legislation before about Tuesday. So I think let's not get too excited and see whether we can get some form of clarity over before the beginning of next week.
And we've been asked if stud owners need to get a DEFRA account, or is that something that the transporters would deal with?
A DEFRA account?
That could be over the government gateway account, couldn't it?
IPAFs. IPAFs is if I was a stud owner, I would get my transporter to do it because it's hideous. But as a transporter, I wish all my stud owners would do it because it's hideous. But you know, it's a thing you have to do.
I think it's ask your transporter and see if they like the hideous task of doing that. So
yeah,
by sounds of it, and hopefully they'll say, of course, sir, much or madam.
And it's what they get paid for anyway. So
Yeah, for a small fee. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of, we had said quite a lot of questions about foals and travelling of foals, a number of which were pretty similar. I'm going to ask you one of the ones that's pretty typical, just so that we've got a. I know Simon as well may have some more news on this from the EU task force size, but what precisely is the position for a foal travelling to the EU with its mother for covering? What age must it be? Does it need a blood test? Does it need a means of security for VAT? Does it need a passport? If it doesn't, if it doesn't have a passport, how can it be traced back out to the EU? We have then been asked a question about how that would change with the animal health law, but I suggest we put that to one side, I think, for now. But just in terms of where we are now and travelling foals under 30 days of age, I mean, our understanding is that you know, that we're seeking clarification to not to travel because you could get stopped. But Simon, is there any further news on that from the task force size?
Well, both yes, putting my task force hat on, and also we have asked DEFRA, who've been very helpful in following that up. We don't have an answer, unfortunately, yet. I mean, I suppose there are three aspects to this: is can a foal travel on the mare's passport, and also can a foal travel on the mare's health certificate, and the third one is can it travel under 30 days of age? The last two of those we are seeking clarification on. Our understanding is that a foal can travel on the mare's passport, so there is no need to get a fast-track passport within the first, until it's weaned, and obviously then it won't be travelling with the mare. So we're waiting for clarification on that, but I think probably it's important to say at this point that it's certainly the task force is extremely against any separation of mare and foal for the purpose of sending the mare for covering. So it's an important question, and we are chasing it up.
Thanks. Okay. So if I move on to the health requirements, are export certificate blood tests needed for horses brought into the UK for sale, but then not sold and immediately returned to the EU? I'm guessing because they're going back to the EU, they probably are. But Kevin, what's your understanding of that?
I think the question, by export certificates, they mean health certificates, I believe, rather than a Weatherbys thing. Yeah, all horses need a health certificate coming in from the EU. The UK currently doesn't require any blood testing. So arguably the sales companies do. So it would be sensible to provide the blood tests for the sales company through APHA laboratories, so that the animal already has the blood test needed for export. Of course, what isn't clear at the moment, for a horse is bought at a public sale, it's taking DEFRA around 5 days to issue a health certificate. So the buying a horse on a Friday afternoon and having it on a lorry that night isn't going to happen. And the permanent health certificate, of course, requires isolation from others not of the same health status for 30 days. And it's a question of whether the vet signing the certificate considers going through a public auction as an act of isolation from others not of the same health status. So that's not been clarified yet either.
Okay, anyone want to add anything to that? No, okay. Then we've got a very sort of specific question here, but what I think is quite useful for illustrating as an example. When walking in a mare from England to Ireland, do you need a second export health certificate for the inbound journey before July 2021? If so, as in most cases, a mare will be leaving later in the day of her arrival for cover. Is it permissible for the export health certificate to be completed on the day of departure rather than the day prior to departure? Also, are they able to depart from a different port to the BCP at Dublin that they have entered through up until July 2021?
No is the answer. It takes about 5 days to get an export health certificate in Ireland. So you are not going in and coming out on the same day.
Okay. We've been asked if we know roughly what extra costs will be added on to the previous costs with all these new requirements and customs costs.
I would think I'd be guessing it's going to double in price with the health certification both ends, customs clearance both ends, the BIP costs in Dublin. If you're going with a large group on the Channel Tunnel, it's be a lot more than that. But then I think the question of we voiced this the other day. The animal has to be when it goes to Ireland. The animal has to be examined by a vet and the health certificate written out, and then it has to go to the Dublin Ministry, and then it has to be issued as another health certificate. And they think that for runners, they can probably reduce it to a 3-day turnaround between examination and the issuance of the health certificate. But in terms of a broodmare where there's no pressure, it's going to have to be 5 days.
I just had a question just posted about travelling of foals under 30 days of age. I mean, the answer to that is we still don't have clarification, do we, Simon, that we can travel a foal who is under 30 days. So there is obviously then a risk that some of the BCP may not allow that to enter the country. So the advice is not to. We don't have a clear answer. Is that fair to say?
That's very fair to say. Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. But I mean, we are chasing it up.
But that's obviously something that we're seeking from the EU government to clarify just exactly what the position is. So we're not saying it's unlawful. We're saying there is a big risk if you travel, that you'll travel your foal to the port and then you may get turned back.
Then, Claire, can I just butt in? Every animal has to have a health certificate. The health certificate requires that the animal's been on the premises of origin or other premises for 30 days. If it's not been on God's green earth for 30 days, it won't fulfil those requirements, and therefore can't get a health certificate.
So, Kevin, this is a clear no, that they can't travel as things currently stand.
No, and I mean Simon said that the issue of her travelling on a foal's passport, mare's passport, but you need the passport number to put into IPAFs to generate the health certificate. So the foal does need to have a passport. And the EU won't allow her in, and under the current rules, unless it has a passport and it's been alive for 30 days and it has a health certificate. So it needs the EU to unwind their requirements rather than clarification of this matter, because the health certificates just don't allow for
it. Yeah, so one is effectively contradicting the other, because the legislation is clear, but the actual practical implementation of it doesn't allow it.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's a risk, and Kevin, you're saying actually you can't issue a certificate, so you can't practically do it if somebody comes to you and asks you to do it.
At the moment, without the EU changing, issuing a decision that says that foals at foot are considered part of their dams, or even you could, it wouldn't happen, but the Irish department could turn around and say that we're happy if they put it in writing, so we're happy to accept foals at foot with just the one health certificate, they'd be probably in breach of some EU regulation, but it would just mean that we could just send the mares. And so that's a workaround. Whether you get it or not, I don't know. But the system is to get the health certificate has to be per horse. And the certificate requires the horse to have been alive for 30 days. And to get the health certificate, you need to have a microchip number and a passport number. There are workarounds, but you need to get the other side to agree that they'll accept it.
Yeah, and just to add to what Kevin said, the question we've asked is, do they consider the mare and foal a single epidemiological unit? I mean, they have been together since birth, of course, and they haven't separated. Yeah. And because we're very, very against separating from welfare reasons, separating the mare from the foal, that does need some clarification, because as you say, there is contradiction within the systems and the legislation. And I don't think this has been foreseen. So while this goes right back to a lot of this new legislation, it is teasing out, if that's the right word, some of the inconsistencies which are going to, I'm afraid, come up as we go through this process over the next 6 months.
Okay, hopefully that's made that clearer for everybody. Then just we haven't got much time. We've been over an hour. I'm conscious, but we'll try. We've got I think 3 more questions. So, Kevin, I believe you covered this earlier. But if a stud horse box is only moving mares and foals from its own stud, does the vehicle need to get an EU vehicle approver certificate and the EU transporter authorization?
Does the operator of the vehicle think that they need? Do they possess a UK transporter authorization? If they think they need a UK transporter authorization, then I would argue that they probably ought to think they need an EU one. If it's just an owner driver and it's totally private, then I suspect they won't have a UK transporter authorization and therefore won't need an EU one. It's a knotty one, if I think going into Ireland you wouldn't have a problem, provided the horses are owned by the people who own the horse box and it all goes through as private. It's that argument in Calais with somebody who's being officious, who then says, well, these are going for covering, it's a commercial transaction, what are you going to do? I couldn't begin to advise somebody that was a sensible thing to do, but provided if it is a genuine private, like owner driver, 2 show jumpers, owner of a mare driving the lorry, there's no reason why you shouldn't go through as private, so you wouldn't need a transporter authorization.
And we've been asked whether we think that the walk-in of mares and foals this covering season for Ireland is going to be possible. Last ferry from Wales, midday covering and returning on the last ferry to the UK. Do we think that's going to be possible?
No, you won't get a health certificate under the Irish system in time. So we've been told it's a 5-day process, so it could be 4 days before you come back.
Okay. Final question is saying, where you touched on the point earlier, but what is the situation regarding bringing a mare back from the Keeneland January sale to Ireland?
Is a tricky one, because if you get a really nice share load and you can fly back to London, you're stranded because you can't go to Europe for 3 months then. So you're going to have to fly the mare back into mainland Europe and then transit the UK on the land bridge to get her into Ireland. Because going the longest possible way round is obviously the best way for the mare. But the EU system just cannot cope with an Irish destined horse arriving at Heathrow, because that's not the point of entry into the union, and they just will not take them. It just ticks all the wrong boxes, and the horse then has to get an EU health certificate from the UK. Now, whilst the EU health certificate, the vet can sign it off because he can complete all the attestations that are required by the EU. The 11th page of the document is a declaration from the owner to say that the animal has been in the country of dispatch for 90 days. And if it's only just got off a plane from Keeneland, it hasn't been. So they're really going to have to fly to Liège, Amsterdam, or somewhere like that, and then come through on a DOCOM through the land bridge. So it's possible.
Yeah, so hopefully that's that. What we're going to do, we've also had some other questions that we've not had time to answer today. We've had a few questions around the equine premises number process, which we'll pick up directly with those involved as well. I think what we'll do, thank you very much for all the questions you've submitted, both in advance and on the day. What we'll do is we'll look at the FAQs that are on the TBA website. We'll update those with these questions and answers as well, so that this information is all in one place and that people can access it. We've also had some requests, to create some flow charts. We'll look at doing that as I mentioned earlier, and possibly to sort of outline some best practice procedures on the basis of this. So yeah, I mean, just really to point out, there's a number of resources that are being updated on sometimes an hourly, but certainly daily and regular basis. The central hub for all information for the racing industry is on the BHA's website, and recommend checking up there. It's got signposts to all the key gov.uk sites. The TBA as well has a page on its website, and on there are some breeding specific FAQs, as I've just referenced, and we'll make sure we keep those updated and added to as more questions come through. There's also an industry email for any Brexit related questions. I'd ask you, if possible, please to direct any Brexit specific questions to this email address rather than to the general TBA one. They then get sort of filtered, and then the emails then get sent to the person most relevant to be able to answer your question. So that's the best and quickest email address to use. I'll hand over to Charlotte, but I'd just like to very much thank our panelists today, to Peter, to Kevin and Simon as well, who, this is, it's a very complex issue, as you've heard, and all three of them are very much working on all of our behalfs at the moment. And I think as an industry, we should very much thank them for not only their time today, but for all that they're trying to do to seek clarification on these matters on behalf of us all. But I'll hand over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope you found it useful. If there's anything you've missed in today's webinar, we'll be putting a recording of the event today on our YouTube channel. So please do check that out in the next 3 days. Thanks again to our speakers, Peter, Kevin, Simon and Claire, for all of their time today, and thanks for joining us.